The warm-up says, use complete the square to rewrite the following equation in vertex form. It's currently in standard form, and they want it to be rewritten in vertex form, which will look like this. Y equals a times x minus h squared plus k. So for this particular problem, they're not asking you to solve. They don't want to know what x equals. They want you to take it from standard form to vertex form, and you can do that by completing the square. So the first step is move the constant to the other side by adding the 5 to the other side. Then you now have x squared minus 16x equals 5. The next step is to take your b value, which is, right, thank you, divide it by 2, which will become a, and square it, which will become a 64. You then add that number in to both sides of the equation. So you'll add it on this side, right here, and then on the other side, you'll add it to the 5. Okay, on the right, it will simply just combine because 5 plus 64 is 69. On the left, we've now created a new trinomial that can be factored, and it's a perfect square trinomial because it'll be the same things. What times what is 64? But for those two 8's to add to a negative 16, they both need to be negative. Remember, they have to be identical because in the very next step, you're going to write it once and square it. And if they weren't identical, you can't do that. They could be if this were a positive 16. Okay, now, remember, the directions for this problem were not to solve. Okay, look or you'll get confused. So at this point, I'm not going to try to get x by itself. I'm not going to square root this and square root this because I'm not trying to get x by itself. I'm trying to rewrite it in vertex form. Well, look, if I throw a y equals right here, isn't there an understood 1 here in the a place? And then x minus 8 would be the x minus h. But k is on the wrong side, so I just need to subtract it over, and it'll become y equals 1 times x minus 8 squared minus 69. And now it's vertex form. Okay, you were supposed to do the odds for homework, so now I'm going to do the evens. The first thing you should do is what? Be factored. Are there two numbers that multiply to make a negative 84 and add to make a negative 10? No. So that means we're going to have to use complete the square to solve this problem. So what do we do first? Correct. This 84 needs to be added to the other side. So now I have n squared minus 10n equals 84. And the reason I left so much space is because I'm about to add in a number on each side. And where does that number come from? The b, which is negative 10, divided by 2 squared. That'll become a negative 5 squared, which is a 25. Now on the right side, I just add those two numbers together and I get what? 109. On the left side, I now have a new trinomial that can be factored because there are numbers that multiply to 25 and add to negative 10. And what are those numbers? Minus 5 and minus 5. Now, they match, and they should always match because the very next step is to be able to write it once and square it. Okay, now look at the board for a second. If our goal was just to write this in vertex form, at this point, you would just, don't write this because this is not our goal. But if our goal was to write this in vertex form, at this point, you would just subtract the 109 over and you'd have it in vertex form. Does that make sense? But our goal for this worksheet was not to write it in vertex form. The directions on this worksheet said solve. So I need to continue solving until I get the n by itself. So what is my next step? Square root it to cancel out the 2, and then square root this side. That now becomes n minus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 109. And now the last step beginning by itself is what? Add the 5. So now I have n equals plus or minus square root of 109 plus 5, or you may see it written on the test 5 first and then plus or minus the square root of 109. It's the same thing. You can write it in either order. But say on the test neither of your choices look like that. It may be because they literally type them in and round them. What is the square root of 109 plus 5? What did you say? I didn't hear you. Okay. So let me type it in. The square root of 109 you're right. Plus 5 should not be up under the radical. So 15.4 is correct. The 5 is outside. And then now we're going to type in the negative square root of 109 plus 5, and you do get negative 5.4. Okay, this is how, look, this is what it'll look like. Negative square root 109, and then arrow over, and then plus 5. Okay, now just put down your pencil for a second and look up here. The reason those are the answers is because, think about it. When you're trying to factor, you're trying to think of the two numbers that multiply to make a negative 84 and add to make a negative 10, correct? Well, we couldn't think of any numbers because they're not whole numbers. They're decimals. But if 15.4 is the final answer once it's solved, doesn't that mean as a factor it would have been n minus 15.4? Isn't it always the opposite sign when it's written like this? And then this negative 5.4 would have originally been n plus 5.4. Does everybody understand why they're opposite signs in factors? Some of y'all aren't paying attention. Now look. Negative 15.4 plus 5.4 is what? It's negative 15.4 plus 5.4 is negative 10. Those two numbers add to a negative 10. Now multiply them together in your calculator. Negative 15.4 times 5.4, which is very close to negative 84. Why do you think it's not exactly negative 84? Because we were rounding. Had we not rounded and we literally typed in every number, it would have been exactly negative 84. Does that make sense? All right, number 14. Are there two numbers that multiply to make a negative 62 and add to make a negative 20? No, there's not. So what should I do first? Right, we have to complete the square. So first we're going to add the 62 to the other side. And now we have p squared minus 20p equals 62. But I left plenty of space on each side so that I can add in the b over 2 squared number. What is the b? And when you divide that by 2, you get negative 10. And when you square that, you get 100. Now on the right side, you just add them together and that becomes correct. And on the left side, we can now factor. P times p is p squared, and what times what is 100, and also adds to negative 20. negative 10, and negative 10. And remember, those should always match so that in the very next step, you can write it once and square it. All right, now, if our goal was just to write this in vertex form, what would we do now? Right. We would just minus the 162 back over if our goal was just to write it in vertex form. But our goal is to solve, which means we need to get p by itself. So what do we need to do? First, square root to get rid of that power of 2. And then square it this side. And now we have p minus 10 equals plus or minus square root of 162. And now what do we do? Add the 10. Now remember, you may see it written like this, or you may see them write the 10 first, then plus or minus the square root of 162. And you might want to type it in like that, that way you don't accidentally put the 10 on the inside. Okay, so now figure out what each of them are by typing them in. Okay, and you should end up with 22.7 and negative 2.7. Okay, y'all ready for number 16? What should we do first? See if we can multiply to get negative 51 and add to get 14. Right, this one can be factored, so we don't have to go through the long process of completing the square because there are two numbers that do that, a positive 17 and a negative 3. We'll multiply to make a negative 51, and when you add them, you'll get a 14. Okay, now that's just factored. We're not finished. You have to solve it, which means you set them both equal to 0. And so your solutions are just the opposite sign. M equals negative 17 and M equals positive 3. You'll still get those numbers, yes. All right, number 18. Are we going to have to complete the square, or can we factor? There's numbers that multiply to negative 5 and add to negative 16. Right, there's numbers, but they're not whole numbers. So we're going to complete the square. So what do we need to do first? And so now we have v squared minus 16v equals 5. And I left plenty of space to add in my number that is obtained by doing the b divided by 2 squared. What? Yeah. Okay, so doesn't that become a negative 8 squared, which is a 64. Now on the right side, you just simply add those together and you get 69. On the left side, we factor it by looking for two numbers that do what? Okay, and that'll be negative 8, negative 8. And remember, they have to match because this is a perfect square trinomial. And the reason we need them to match is so in the next step, we can write it once and square it. Right? What if this question just said put it in vertex form? What would you do now? Subtract the 69 over with the b minus x squared and you'd be done. You'd have it in vertex form. But since this question isn't asking that and they're asking you to solve it, we now square root and you get b minus a equals plus or minus square root of 69. And now the last step to get the b by itself is what? add 8, add 8. And so you can write it like that, or you can reverse the order and write it like this. It's the same thing. And then you can type it in whichever way you want and get the two solutions for V. And I am tired. Okay, what'd y'all get? 16.3 and negative 0.3. You can just leave. I just round them all to the 10th place. Negative square root of 69 plus 8. And remember, guys, you don't have to write this, but I want everybody to understand this. Okay, in the previous question, before I erased, look. These were the factors, right? M plus 17 and M minus 3. So the final solutions were a negative 17, the exact opposite of what it looked like as a factor, and M equals 3, the opposite of M minus 3. So for this one, wouldn't the factors be a V minus 16.3 because the final solution is positive 16.3, and a V plus 0.3 because the solution is negative 0.3? Those numbers add to negative 16, and those two numbers multiply to negative 5. I mean, I know you can see that they add to negative 16. Okay, think about this like money. If you were in debt $16.30 and somebody gave you 30 cents, you're now just in debt $16. But you'd actually have to multiply negative 16.3 times 0.3 to see that it makes that when you multiply. And it may not be exact, but it'll round up to it. It's not exact because we've been rounding. All right, number 20. What can we do? Complete the square or factor? Right. Thank goodness there are two numbers that do this. What are they? Positive. Yes. Say that you can't think of the numbers. You can still do complete the square and you'll end up with the correct answers. Okay, so wouldn't that mean the final answers are just negative 15 and positive 3? Okay, you don't have to write this, but I'm about to quickly complete the square for this problem to show you that you'll get the same thing. The first thing I would do is add the 45 over, correct? Then to fill in these blanks, I would take the b, which is 12, divide it by 2, and that'd be 6, and square it and get 36. Then I would just factor this side by looking for two numbers that multiply to make 36 and added to make 12, and that's 6 and 6. This side would then become, what is that, 81? Now I would write that as a binomial squared. Now I would square root both sides and get x plus 6 equals plus or minus. You can leave it as the square root of 81, or you could just go ahead and write 9, because isn't the square root of 81 9? And now look, when you minus 6 on both sides, you end up with a positive 9 minus 6, which is 3, and a negative 9 minus 6, which is negative 15. The same two solutions we got when we factored it. So if you can't think of the numbers, or you just forget to try factoring, if you complete the square, you're still going to get the right answer. It just takes a little longer to do. All right, now go to the next page. We're going to learn something easier. And actually, we're not learning it. It's kind of old material. Okay, the directions for this page say identify the vertex, direction of opening, and the minimum maximum value of each. Isn't this the equation of a parabola in vertex form? We know it's a parabola because the highest exponent's 2. Okay? And we see that it's in vertex form because we already learned what vertex form is. It's y equals a times x minus h squared plus k. Yeah. So remember, the formula contains a minus. So when we go to do the vertex in number 1, what number is sitting in the h place? Okay, but think about it. For this to have ended up as a plus, wouldn't that have meant it was an x minus, because the formula is a minus, a negative 4? Okay, let me say that again. The formula is x minus. So the only way this could have ended up being a plus sign is if it had been a negative 4 plugged in for h. So your h is negative 4. Remember when we learned this? It's always the opposite of what was in there. And then what number is sitting in the k place? A negative 1. Now, what is the a value? Negative 2. And that determines the opening, how it opens. Does it open up or down? Down. So if the parabola opens down, wouldn't that place the vertex right here? Guys, wouldn't the vertex be at the top of the parabola? So if it opens down, wouldn't this point be the maximum point? Your vertex is your maximum for this problem? All right, number 2. That's all you do on this problem. The vertex, whether it opens up or down, and what that makes the vertex, the max or the min. So for number 2, I'm just going to write V for vertex. What do you mean? Oh, I don't know what you mean. What number's in the h place? But isn't that a negative 4 sitting there? Does everybody understand why there's a negative 4 sitting there? Because for that to have ended up a plus, it had to have been an x minus a negative 4, which made it turn into an x plus 4. And then what number is sitting in the k place? Negative 6. Is this parabola going to open up or down? Down, because your a value is a negative number, negative 2. And if your parabola opens down, the vertex would be up here, which is the maximum point. Yeah. It said, look, in the directions it says identify the vertex, the direction of opening, and the min or max. All right, number 3. What is the vertex? Negative 5, positive 4. Will this parabola open up or down? Down, because your a value is a negative 1, which makes the vertex up here, which will be a maximum point. What's the vertex? Is this parabola going to open up or down? Down. And that makes your vertex the highest point on it, which is the max. Number 6. What's the vertex? Correct. Positive 6, positive 2. Because remember, this minus does not belong to the 6. It belongs to the formula. Is this parabola going to open up or down? Down, which means the vertex will be the maximum point. If the parabola opens down, the vertex is at the top, the max. If the parabola opens up, the vertex is at the bottom, which is the minimum point. What's different about number 6? No, because for this question, there's no minimum because it goes down forever. Okay, this one's not in vertex form. It's in standard form. Isn't this technically y equals ax squared plus bx plus c? So by looking, okay, is it that standard form, y equals ax squared, and then since nothing else was there, the b and the c are zeros? But you can't identify the vertex when you're just looking at it in standard form. We can identify whether the parabola is going to open up or down. Up. Your a is positive 1/2, which will mean the vertex will be the minimum point. But how do we find the vertex when we don't have vertex form? You can graph it. But no, you're right. Go to y equals and graph 1/2 x squared. I'm just going to type in 0.5 instead of 1/2. And when you graph it, you'll see that the vertex of the parabola is at the origin, 0, 0. That's because nothing has happened to it. It hasn't been shifted up or down. The only thing that's happened to this parabola is it got stretched wider because of the 1/2 out front. Remember, if your A value is less than 1, it's a vertical stretch, which makes it, vertical shrink, which makes it wider. And that's the only thing that occurred because everything else was zeros. That's why it's a 0, 0. It doesn't get moved up, down, left, or right. All right, number 7. What's the vertex? 1. Will this open up or down? Up, because there's an understood 1 in the A place, and that'd be a positive 1, which means your vertex is down here, which is the minimum value of the parabola. The maximum does not exist because it goes up forever. Number 8, what is the vertex? It does open up because your A is a positive 1, and that makes this vertex a minimum. All right, number 9. What is the vertex? Does this parabola open up or down? Down, which means the vertex is a maximum point. And then number 10, what's the vertex? And the parabola opens down because your A is negative. It's also going to be a shrink because it's less than 1, and that makes the vertex the maximum point. You need to work on page 11. Whatever's not finished turns into homework.